Welcome to the Data Science Series, speaker series at the University of San Francisco, sponsored by the Data Institute. Data Institute is the umbrella organization for which everything data science falls under at the University of San Francisco. Our speaker today is Pratyush Tiwari, founder and CEO of InkLink, building trust infrastructure for human and AI interactions. He is also the founding partner of Rivet, a venture studio focused on AI infrastructure for the next-gen internet. He holds dual MBA degrees from the Wharton School and the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. Today's talk will be about startups and a founder's journey. Please help me give the speaker a round of applause.
Thank you, guys. First of all, I'd like to say I can look at you guys and see how much talent is in this room, right? So let's start with an applause to yourself. Sometimes we just forget how talented we all are, right? We're just so caught up in doing day-to-day things that we forget to appreciate ourselves. So let's start with that. Let's give an applause to you guys. You guys are awesome. All right. Context is really important in most things in life. So let me start with that. Let me talk to you guys about my journey, my career path over time. My background is in math and computer science, and then I went over to the dark side. I did my MBAs, went into the business side. But data, analytics, math is still core to what I do and what I believe in. So my journey started in 1997. I'm old, right? So it started in India, where we started evaluating a lot of security algorithms for the internet. This was 1997, really early era in the internet. And this is the time when you start seeing algorithms like SSL, RSA, Blowfish. A lot of these algorithms were coming out, and we were evaluating these algorithms in the perspective of security, right? The math made sense, but is it really secure? Then I moved on to Hewlett-Packard, where I did a team that was working in voice recognition. Now, voice recognition is one of the first consumer use cases where people were using a lot of stochastic processes to predict, what people are essentially, or interpreting what people are trying to say. Now, voice recognition technology had been around since the 1970s. But this was one of the technologies for many, many years was 80% there. And it was only until about 2005 then a big leap forward came. My team essentially, they left HP, joined this company called Nuance, and a lot of the work that you see on Siri is developed by Nuance, which was developed by our team going forward. But if you see the journey of voice recognition, it's taken about 50 years for the technology to mature and to be where it is today. And I think the AI journey is very similar. Right? That journey probably started earlier, probably in the 1950s, right? So 75 years of progress that we're seeing right now. And that's why I say context is important, right? Nothing happens in a vacuum. Everything is built on top of other things. Or as Stephen Hawking said, right, you are sitting on top of challenges. Right? So I did voice recognition, then I did my MBA, went over to the super dark side, did investment banking for a while, absolutely hated it. Right? So after that, started my first company. This was a company called Knowrtal. We did patent analytics, especially for chemistry and biomedical patents. And this was a very hard problem to solve at that time. Because the problem we were trying to solve was in these patents. Patents are made incomprehensible on purpose. Right? Reason is that the companies want to disclose as little as possible when they file a patent. Right? Because you don't want to give away all your trade secrets to companies. Right? And they also want to protect themselves against copying, not just today, but in the future as well. So in chemistry patents, what they would do is essentially think that they would create a template of a chemical, let's call it a patent, right? And the patent would have placeholders. And they would patent this template. And they would say that there are all these placeholders, and the placeholders can be anything. And they would list out 100 different organic chemistry, let's say. So when a competitor is analyzing a patent, think about it. How do you know whether a chemical compound you're developing, does it intrude on somebody else's patent? Maybe the technology was there. So we were attempting it. We used some open source tools. We did a lot of pattern recognition at that time. Extremely hard, right? I would say we were about 50 to 70% successful. And this theme is going to come up again and again. The first 80% is achievable. The last 20% that takes the most of our time. We got to about 80%, which was state of the art at that point in time. We exited that company in 2013. It was a reasonably successful exit. And then I started my second company, along with 3 other partners, in the fintech space. So this company was called MoneyLion. It was a neobank, and the thesis was that we wanted to give ordinary citizens a private banking-like experience. How do you do that? And we wanted to do it with data. Right? And we thought data was, we had some theses around how the world was going to evolve. And one of the things was that data and algorithms are going to give us an edge. So imagine, we went along this journey. Imagine in, let's say, a couple of years, we grew to about 100. Out of the 100 people, 30 people in the team were essentially part of our data science and data engineering. And at 2015, 30% of the company being in that space tells you how important data science was to us. Right? So let's go to the first slide. Right. So in terms of eras, I would call this the big data era, right? Where AI was a dirty word. Nobody said AI, not even in a whisper. But they used to call this big data, right? Logistic regression was the king, right? You do logistic regression, random forests started to come in, started to do this. People started trying to analyze performance of algorithms, ROC curves, right? Everybody was focused on ROC curves, how are models performing, false positives versus true positives, things like that. And what we saw was that if you look at the stack, right, I would classify it into 4 parts, right? Algorithms, data, infrastructure, and a generic placeholder about enablers. A lot of focus was on the algorithms, but the data wasn't ready. And the infrastructure wasn't ready to do meaningful analysis at scale in this era, right? And we faced it as a company then and there. That was the reason why we needed such a big team, because data engineering was hard, right? Even if you had the modelers create the model, just putting that model into production was incredibly hard, right? Data cleansing was hard. Feature extraction was hard, right? And that's why you needed such a big team to essentially do it. So what we focused on was essentially bank transaction data. So our core thesis was that when you look at a score like a FICO score, right? A FICO score isn't really a good prediction of your future credit performance, right? It just takes your past performance and tries to predict it, but it's not a great performance. It's a lagging indicator. Our thesis was that bank transactions, instead of being a lagging indicator, will help us create a leading indicator for credit performance. So we focused on that. Now, if you see, look at bank transactions, right? You're looking at magnitudes of data more than the data that goes into creating the FICO score. Right? So immediately we had this data problem. You look at bank transaction data. if you ever look at a data statement, right, it's unstructured, right? A lot of times, the features, the headers are wrong or can very easily be misinterpreted. So we had to deal with a lot of feature extraction, feature engineering at that point in time. The technology wasn't there, right? The tooling wasn't there at this point in time, right? So big data, people used to talk about big data, and you'll see this in business, right? All these buzzwords suddenly gain traction over time. Right? Big data was the buzzword, but very few people understood what big data really meant. Very few people were actually even taking action on that. Right? We were one of the first companies to essentially think of it as a stack and think what we can do, at least from a data perspective. We did not have the resources to even think about infrastructure at this point. Now, call the next era cloud scale. Right? And in this era, suddenly, more companies. When you see a gap in the market, companies always try to fill it. Companies started appearing in the tooling space, in the data cleansing space, right? A lot of big companies that you see, like DataRobot, essentially started this era because there was this demand to do automated push, right? Companies like Snowflake started, essentially thinking about, how do you collate all this data and get it ready for analytics teams to start running algorithms. Cloud was a buzzword. This is the other thing. Businesses, and when I talk about businesses, it's not startups, right? In San Francisco, we're in a bubble, right? Here we see a lot of these companies starting to service mainstream businesses. Mainstream businesses hear these buzzwords, but it takes some time for technology to percolate across, right? So here you would see that AWS was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but it was mostly used by technology. But in this era, mainstream companies started switching. And that essentially was like a Cambrian explosion. The moment the data started coming out from silos, it started going to the cloud, people started realizing the power and the value of data. Right? So, very, very interesting time to be in. Lots of changes were happening in this time. A lot of things were happening essentially around data and enablers, but the infrastructure part still wasn't getting fully developed. But then we get to current era, right? Which I think started in about 2022, even though a lot of research in AI was happening, but a lot of it was happening in labs. It was in the background. Wasn't mainstream anyway. So from an applied AI guy, right, I knew about, for example, the transformers paper, but I did not know how transformative it could be, right? So that transformation, at least in the business space, and especially for people who were in applied AI and who were looking for ways to improve our algorithms and improve our processes and structures, we started hearing things from the labs in about 2020, where we started hearing that, look, very, very interesting things are happening. And this is about the time when OpenAI and a lot of stuff was happening at Google. And then 2022, it hit everybody, right? The first 100 million plus parameter model, right? It just blew people's minds. How did this happen? And then infrastructure started developing, right? And technology companies focused so much on infrastructure in this area because they were the first to realize the power of AI and where AI was taking over. So you started seeing the Hugging Faces of the world. You started, I'm sure that's doing a lot of work on Kubernetes and things like that. So a lot of these technologies started even changing our AI stack, right? And dramatically changed the AI stack. And here I think that in this era, that's when people started focusing on all the four components of stack, which essentially enables AI. 2025, we're currently. And this again is from a business perspective, right? For the businesses, most businesses essentially, in terms of this stack, are focusing on the top two parts of the stack. A lot of it is around embeddings, it's about RAG, it's about private research. Companies want to protect their own data, their own IP. And that's why even now there is hesitancy in using Gen AI in companies. And a lot of companies are starting, companies like Dlee, that are essentially trying to push Gen AI into the stack of larger companies. And this process has just started. And that's why you see so much investment happening in this space. So many companies getting seeded, because this is the time when businesses have started adopting AI. So the way businesses work, right? Businesses have cost sectors, right? So businesses have budgets. They allocate budgets at the beginning of the year, right? Something that happens with big businesses. Businesses did not have a bucket for AI. That's why they were not spending on AI. In 2018, they started creating a bucket, a cost bucket for cloud infrastructure spending. That's why cloud infrastructure spending skyrocketed. Now, companies have started creating a bucket for AI spend. And that's why suddenly companies are actually experimenting and spending money on technology, which they think is going to, at least initially, it's mostly about efficiency. It is going to make their processes more efficient, right? So the mantra for 2025 is efficiency, right? How can I make my sales team more efficient? How can I make enterprise search more efficient? How can I make my customer support more efficient, right? But that is 2025. What's going to happen in the future, right? I can say nobody knows what's going to happen in the future, which is correct, but there are certain themes that are emerging. Right? One is responsible AI. A lot of work is being done on AI, right? So the moment AI starts getting into mainstream, starts getting into businesses, compliance becomes really important. Right now, it's like the Wild West, right? But when it goes into companies, there are consequences of hallucinations, right? There are real-world impacts to what AI does or doesn't do, right? Frameworks are being developed, guardrails are being developed around AI. But for various reasons, we are in very early innings of how we use AI. Right? There are geopolitical things that are happening. Lots of developments that are happening, which probably will impact what type of guardrails we use. Right? For example, a few days ago, right, Jack Dorsey and Elon Musk were talking about how we should do away with copyright laws. Right? So when you think about it, that's a very strange thing to say. Copyright laws have been years, right? But they look at geopolitical things and they see that other countries probably do not have as strong copyright laws as us, or can easily copy, material, and that gives them an unsurmountable advantage over countries that have strong copyright protections. Right? So a lot of these things essentially are being driven by geopolitical things. But for companies, it is about building these guardrails for compliance. So what's next in the next 5 years, right? And nothing here that I'm saying is, that I'm savant and this is what happened. This is all mainstream, right? Agentic AI, everybody talks about it. And there's a reason why agentic AI is so big. You look at AI funding from a VC perspective now, 95% of money going into AI is going into agentic startups. Right? The reason is that this is a market which is worth trillions and trillions. People realize that. Right? And putting a few $1 million here and there to get a chance at a stake, that trillions and trillions of dollars of transformation that is going to happen in the next few years, probably faster than a lot of people realize, is what drives a lot of AI investments. Edge AI, right? On-device LLMs, right? It's going to be a huge market. It's going to change the way we interact with AI. And you see Apple has been trying, succeeding right now. The biggest model that you can actually put in 7 billion parameter model, not very smart based on the architecture of but a lot of work is happening on edge AI. A lot of work is happening around AI for robotics, right? Work on the hardware space as well as spatial awareness for AI. A lot of work is happening there. And finally, in guardrails again. A lot of things are happening on these spaces, and probably a lot of investment, a lot of focus, at least from a technology perspective, is going to be around these few things. Doesn't mean that the businesses that consume AI are going to be focused on things this way. These are enablers, right? So there are two parts. One is technology development. The second is how do you translate all the advancement in technologies into businesses, right? So there are opportunities in all those sides. It's a technology development where probably there is a lot of capital because you do things all the time. The bigger opportunity is on how do you translate that technology to something that businesses can use. Right. So this was just a primer on how I think, let me call it AI. AI has evolved in the last 10 years. And we're still, I think, still in that 80%, right? We still haven't figured the last 20% out. Because when you think about the Sam Altmans in the world, the Dario Amadeus in the world, say that, AGI, whichever way you define AGI, is 12 months away. But when you hear the other side, Jan LeCun's or the Ilya Sutskever, those people say that we're still a few innovations away from AGI. And I personally fall in the second camp because I've seen this before in my experience with voice recognition, and how hard it is to bridge that 20% and how long it takes, right? And that's why I think, going back to my earlier comment, that context is important. Learning happens in background, right? So my take is it's probably going to take longer for AI to get to AGI. As I said, whichever way you define it, I don't like to use that term. But it's going to be even longer before businesses start using AI. So at this point in time, I'd like to stop, and I'd like to hear from you guys. How can I answer? The second part of the presentation is a little bit more about what we are doing right now. I don't know how interested you are. Something like that. Right now, we have two ventures going on. One is a venture studio. How many of you guys know the concept of a venture studio? Have you guys heard of the venture studio? Right? It's very different from a VC fund. A venture studio essentially develops its own ideas and funds its own ideas. The VC firm essentially looks for ideas. As an operator, it's easier for us to fund our own ideas because we have a very particular view of the world than to fund others. So for us, Venture Studio is a startup as well. We're figuring out how to start and scale companies which we think are going to look very different than companies in the past, right? imagine, let's say, in this context, if AI agents, become prevalent. As a thought experiment, you think that companies in the future are going to be thousands of people strong, right? Our guess is we're very rarely going to see companies that have thousands of people. Right? So for us, it's very important to understand how do you build a company at scale with 5 people. What will it take, right? From a processes perspective, from a technology perspective. So that's why for us, the venture studio is also an experiment. And I'll talk to you a little bit about the first company that we seeded. It's called InkLink. Where is Wei-Chun? Right. So Wei-Chun is interning with us. Wei-Chun used to work for MoneyLion, my previous company, and we're very happy to have him. It's a very small setup because again, we want to develop something with a very, very small team. We're about 6 people now. Probably don't want to go more than that. Let's see if we can actually. I can't talk about the venture studio. I can't talk about InkLink. I can talk a little bit more about my founder journey, what I did. As a founder, I have experience in the corporate world. I can talk a little bit about what it feels like working for a bigger company than a startup or technology.
Can you talk more about what it's like having a venture studio as opposed to a venture capital fund? And what are the difficulties that you might be having that other industries don't have to kind of deal with? Or do you know if you know of any other people who are also their own venture studios? What they should be?
So just like venture capital companies, venture studios come in multiple flavors. The one big difference between venture capital and venture studios apart from structure of what you do is the type of people who start. Typically, people who start venture studios have been founders, have been entrepreneurs. That's why they have a very strong view of the world. Their experience is colored by their past, which is what they felt worked. Whereas in VC, there's a big mix. And I would say, I could be wrong, I would say that only about 20% of the VCs have been operators. About 80% of the VCs that you'll encounter will have. So their view of the world, their view of evaluating companies and evaluating ideas is slightly different from the way a founder will evaluate. And then with being a founder and an operator, I think there is also a little bit of hubris, right? Because you've done this before, you think, I know, right? I know what works, what doesn't work. It is hubris. I don't really know how things are going to work in a completely different setup, a completely different company, but I have a very strong view. When I say I generalize and say operators and founders. So we also think that we have a view, which is different. And we want to essentially put our money where our mouth is and say that we will invest in companies that are. That's from a philosophical perspective. Now, from the infrastructure side, right? A venture studio actually seeds them. Right? There are a couple of models. Some venture studios look for external ideas as well. It's very similar to accelerators, it's like Y Combinators, get external ideas, and then they help the founders, surround the founders with the founder team, and help develop the idea in-house till a certain stage where they then start looking for external funding. Our model is a little different. We only will seed ideas. And we want to develop a process where we build education, we build skill sets internally with people that we work so that it's these people who can then essentially scale it up. So that way we're a little different from a traditional venture studio.
Thank you so much for this timeline. Well, one question mine is similar to a follow-up. How should we navigate like the cultivation of an idea before approaching like a VC or like a venture studio?
Okay. So I'll come back to this slide. This is something that I personally very strongly believe in, right? There are many flavors of ideas. There's many ways startups succeed. Don't let anybody tell you that I have found a way to make things work. There are many paths to success. Right? But so this is my personal. And again, this is not something that I have to. Mostly, a lot of this talk has been by this guy called Andy National. He is one of the founding partners of Knowrtal. He talked about this, and this is how I but again, this philosophically talks to you, right? So when you look at companies, right? So you can either be right or you can be wrong. The idea can be either consensus or not, right? So if you're wrong, it doesn't matter whether the idea is consensus or not consensus, you will never make it. But even if you're right, but the idea is consensus, over time, you're not going to make money. But the marginal benefit is going to over time because there's going to be so much competition. This is consensus. Everybody believes that, right? Take an example right now. So much funding is going into AI agentic startups, right? But when you look at what these agentic startups do, customer service, sales, right? Enterprise search, maybe a few verticals like legal, right? Most of the money is actually going to this. To me, that is consensus. And over time, some companies obviously are going to be successful, right? But I think as a startup idea, it is very hard to make money if you're consensus, even if. So in my mind, the only way for a startup to succeed, and again, this is personal bias, is that's my wife. Is if you are non-consensus and you're right. Whether you're right or wrong is very hard to tell. Right? The only thing that I control is being non-consensus. Right? So this is the approach we've taken in our venture. How clear this is. So this is how essentially a venture studio works. Again, I don't know why I put this here, but just for context, right? So typically a venture studio has an operating group where you have designers, you have technologists, you have operations people, you have finance, you have customer support. In a centralized location, you have a separate fund through which you fund the startups, and then you start funding these companies. In the beginning, it's the operating studio, which essentially seeds all these companies, gets them to a point. For us, that point is Series A, where you essentially put the companies out in the market, but you nurture those companies to that point. So, in terms of philosophy, again, talking about philosophy, it's this one, right? When you talk to the Y Combinators of the world, right, they found this term called hair on fire problems, right? Find a problem where your customer's hair is on fire, right? And they describe it really, really well. Right? So what they say is, imagine that you're in a room with a person whose hair is on fire, right? If you give that person a brick, that person will still try to put out the fire with the brick, right? Does the brick work? No, but the person will still try it. So that is a hair on fire problem. And where people are willing to try even a brick, because that problem is so visceral. Right? When you think about it, it's actually hard to find problems, right? Do you guys know of any hair on fire problems?
I can cause them.
So it's very hard philosophically, right? So what we believe is, we and people talk about, go talk to customers, figure out a problem, and once you find a problem, then you figure out a solution to the problem. You want to be worse. And again, we are the only ones who try to do this, and we don't claim to do it. We want to start with fire, because we understand. So we come up with a thesis on this is a hypothetical problem, which is worth solving. We come up with a product idea and say that this is how I would solve this. We make it in. Let's call it an MVP. It can be called different things. And then the problem doesn't have to be big. Then what we want is to prove something called a value hypothesis. So a value hypothesis essentially is go and then show the customers. But you see the fundamental difference, you're switching it. You're not going to the customer and saying, what is your problem? Right? You're actually taking a solution and saying, use the solution. A lot of times the customer will say, no. But eventually, once you find a niche where people will say, yes, I can use it, that's where you start. You don't spend a single dollar marketing until you figure your value. Right? So this is the philosophy we're trying to develop, and we're trying to create it and convey into all the startups that we're starting. Any other questions about Wharton Studio starting company? So sorry.
And maybe a different one. The original venture you established seemed to be like very technical. You're going into the patents and analyzing them. How did you find the first customers, or was it the customers, like potential companies have a problem, they go to you? How did that process of like identifying the product or product market fit work there?
That's a great question. So when we started this company, the problem we focused on was something that was very different. Right? So the problem we focused on was saying that look at government contracts. Right? So typically in the US, there's this website called FBO, Fed Biz Ops, where every government contract essentially is and saying that this is a contract, these are the terms of the contract, this is what we're looking at, this is the pricing, this is. And then what happens is, for larger contracts, you essentially form a consortium, saying that, look, I have this capability, let me find people with other capabilities, and together we can fulfill. Right? So the problem we were trying to solve was, how do you find all these other companies that have complementary skill sets to essentially fulfill? So when we developed a product, we started marketing it, we got some traction. And then what we saw was that the biggest issue that companies faced was that how do you analyze capability? A lot of companies don't on their website tell you what we do. Right? So the only publicly available information is things that are important for that company. So how do you evaluate? So we move into patents. And even in that path, when we essentially developed the prototype, talked to companies, the companies that essentially gave us the most feedback or said we wanted something was in chemistry and environmental.
So sort of gradually, starting from the problem of trying to identify, you were trying to be the kind of the market maker for people to figure out who would be a fit for a government contract. And then you pivoted over into people seem to be interested in, like it was your need to identify who is fit based on, like what does the company do based on their patent filings. That's how you pivoted to, when there may be potential interest, there was the chemical industry, and then you made a complete pivot into you're only analyzing patents so that when they're testing drugs, they know they're not infringing someone else's patents. Yes, exactly. Okay, awesome. That's an amazing journey.
Exactly. And you see, most startups have these, but they're essentially epiphanies, right? Because startup is like driving a car. You have absolutely no clear picture despite what people would say. A startup is, at least as a startup founder, is a very unglamorous undertaking. It's unglamorous because there's so much hard work, there's so much uncertainty. And there's so much riding on decisions that you make, decisions that you are making with very little information. Right? So it's like, I tell myself, it's like driving in fog. Sometimes the fog lifts and you see something. And you feel that, oh my God, I'm trying to get a picture. Right? It takes, in my experience, it takes about 4 years for a founder or a company to find its feet. So anything that you do in the first 4 years is essentially finding yourself.
It's like a really broad discovery of the terrain of the problem space.
It is a very broad discovery because most of the companies, again, no general. Obviously, there are people, there are founders who know the problem because they've experienced it and they build it and it's successful. But most of the founders build in spaces where they're not completely familiar with. So for them, it's an exploration space. Once they explore the space, they understand whether what they're thinking, what their thesis. So essentially, it's not just like general knowledge. Right. So, just show of hands. How many people here are interested in working at startups? Incredibly large. How many people want to work for larger technology companies, the Googles, the Facebooks? All right. So let me start because I have experience across sizes of companies. Let me start off with startup. Before that, how many want to start their company? Right? Reasonable. Right? So I'll come up to the start founder experience. But before that, let me talk to you a little bit about working at startups. How many have already worked at startups? Reasonable, right? I'll tell you my experience. You validate or invalidate. The one word I would describe working for a startup is chaos. Would I be right in saying that? Right? It's extremely chaotic. Right? So, whether you're a founder or whether you're working at a startup, it is going to be chaos. Right? Until the company finds its footing, which is are you a person who is okay in a chaos? Thrive in a chaos? It's not a good or a bad thing. Right? You have to ask yourself, do you want to subject yourself to the uncertainties? Right? Everybody talks about, I would call it the glamorous part, but the good part, which is intellectual satisfaction, right? Responsibility, learning, all those things are 100% true. Right? You will learn faster, and I would say about 3 to 4x faster than you learn. Nobody can take that away. Right? You have more responsibility. Certain aspects of your personality will be constant, not all aspects of your personality. But it's chaos. Are you can you thrive? You don't get that perspective, and you don't understand the chaos until you actually go first. So I might say a lot of things here, but until you have that context, you probably discount it. That's what happens, right? But I'm telling you right now, working for startup is chaos. You'll be working on one thing today, something else tomorrow, something completely different. Some things where you need to learn something in 6 hours and finish something. The quality of the code you write or the work you do is not up to the standards that you build yourself up to. You're sometimes embarrassed by the quality of work and the quality of work the company is doing. Right? There are a lot of things. There's a lot of dissonance in working. Right? So search your souls. Right? Whether you I can also tell you that once you start looking at startups, it's very hard to work in your structure. specialized. Right? Because you get used to going to this same page, same field. You go to a company and you be excited. But if you're like, oh, this person is slow, there's so many processes that happen. But there are so many meetings happening. I have to take notes, I have to do stand-ups in the morning, I have to do this, I have to do that. It's really hard. Right? And that's why, as you guys start off, sure, some of you will do that, some of you haven't. But this is almost a new phase. And it's very important to be just a little bit intentional on how you approach it. Now, nobody can be intentional. I absolutely don't believe that you should have a career path. I never had a career path, and one of my favorite books is this book called Range by David Epstein. I highly encourage you to read it. It is about how we taught about this notion that from high school, college, but the book essentially talks about how people find their path. But again, you can be a little bit intentional. That is about knowing what you want, what you think, rather than listening to what is around you. Especially in a bubble like San Francisco, it's very cool to go for a startup. You don't know, this is for you, this is going to bigger companies. Bigger companies, the advantage is that it's like swimming, right? With a startup, you're thrown into the water, whether you know how to swim, splashing around, trying to figure out how to swim. The bigger company, you're giving a swimming coach who takes you and teaches you how to swim. But then, in a startup, you probably learn swimming very quickly. But in a swimming coach, it takes longer because somebody is going to tell you, take it. And that has its advantages, right? Having that structure also gives you a way to structure, right? To understand what it takes to build big companies, build big processes, right? That's something that I see with Gen AI code generation as well. When you look at all the code that is generated, most of the training has been done on open source projects. Right? Open source projects were never geared towards enterprise. Right? So the quality of code essentially is almost amateurish because it's not. A startup, a lot of your code is going to be very hard, it will be a very painful process to actually learn how to scale up big systems. Right? That's the advantage of what there are disadvantages of it. In some sense, you have a career path. Every 2 years you're looking for a promotion. Every year you wait for increment and salary and things like that. Your priorities are very different. And then there are traditional companies, which a lot of people I think are very interesting opportunities as well. Think about going to work for, let's say, technology team. That's a completely different experience from working at Google, right? Because there, you think about how to apply all these skills. The skill set required is almost of data entry, where you are enabling that company. And this is something that a lot of people will tell you, but the satisfaction, the care on doing that, sometimes not more than satisfaction you get working on it. Because here, you're having zero. And trust me, the appreciation of you is going to be a lot more personal. I just want to give that perspective. It probably ranks a lot lower for most people, but obviously there's all great work-life balance. There is satisfaction. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I've done data science as a career for quite a while, and I've seen the contribution of the data scientists both grow, but also become increasingly narrow and marginalized. And when I see you talking about agentive AI, AI that sort of run, a data scientist agent is what I think of. I know that's not exactly what you mean, but I see at work, I see things converging in that way. And I wonder what you think about data scientists, the profession retaining agency for itself. How do we continue to be useful and have anything like agency in a company as our work becomes increasingly automated and self-governing?
I think that's a very interesting question. I'll tell you something about, so I told you about this book on Rivet. I remember something very interesting in the book. So this book was essentially describing, they were taking chess as an example. Right? It takes years to master chess. Right? And in the end, chess grandmasters are so good at chess. But now you look at all these chess companies. And chess engines will beat the grandmasters in 99.99%. Right? So all the chess grandmasters will have. So Gary Kasparov in the early 2000s decided to test this thesis. And what he did was essentially create this competition where teams would play against each other. The composition of the teams would be, there would be chess algorithms, there would be chess grandmasters, and there would be generalists who play chess like chess, but they're not chess grandmasters, but they have other expertise. And then you would see which teams would win. Some teams would have high concentration of grandmasters, some teams would have lower concentration of grandmasters. What they saw consistently was that the teams that had generalists would beat teams with a high concentration. Right? And what it derived from that was, and especially the grandmasters, what the grandmasters were doing was duplicated for the chess algorithms. Right? But the generalists essentially were the ones who were coming up with a strategy of what to focus on, what to focus on. And that's what we do. And I think AI is in a place. We have AI available, but I call them algorithms, but who have domain expertise. Domain expertise think with relative ease. What is harder is experience allows to figure out a direction. Right? And that's how I personally see the data science. The ability to do technical things probably is going to be a little bit, but the thought process, right? The analysis skills, the extraction skills is what's going to differentiate you as a data scientist. It's how do you actually get AI agents to do something. So the work evolves. Right, I'll give you another example. Right, when calculators started becoming people started to question, how do you teach kids math? Right, just calculators. It's different because the advantage of learning math is not just about calculation. It helps us get a viewpoint. So as a data scientist, it's about you. It's about your view of the world. It's about how to use the data, right? Rather than actions. So I personally don't see data science or data scientists. It's what skill, what is it. If it's a needs, then it will be done. But if it's a way of thinking, then I think that will probably be happens.
I think that is a really strong place to end this chat, so that we can do the personal one-on-ones if anyone wants to speak with our guest speaker today. That's typically what happens for about 20 minutes after the fact, as for those of you who are new. And for those of you who are going to be staying with us for the happy hour, you will be in this room for the classroom, and then afterwards we'll come over here and pick you up to go out. So first, let's give our speaker a round of applause.
I'd like to end this with a couple of things which my professors taught me, which I have imbibed. One is never stop reading. Reading is not about reading a few things on it. It does something to the brain. Never stop reading. The 3 books that I'm actually rereading right now are one is that I'm talking about. The other is this very, very interesting book called The History of Intelligence by Mark Bennett. And the third book is one of my favorite books. It's called InkLink. But it's something that when I was an undergrad, my professors told me in final lecture. Something. Second is write. Don't take notes on the computer all the time. Actually use a pen or paper and write down your thoughts. You can doodle if you want, but write it down. It again does something really great. And if you're able to actually construct a thought on paper, it has advantages for constructing that same thought. I personally prefer fountain pens and kind of fountain pens, but note taking, these are 2 things that have stayed with me. And I personally think that they've helped me at least structure thoughts. And